Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to talk a bit about the books that I've been reading this week. Apologies, this little bit of hair is very stubbornly doing this today, and I'm not quite sure what's going on. Anyway, but I want to talk a little bit about the books that I've been reading this week. It's a week where I've not been able to read a ton. My brain has been a little bit fried. I am sort of recovering from some surgery, all fine, all very good. But I've just been very much like in that little sort of bit after surgery where your brain is just like, and we just want to lie down and watch a lot of crappy television, which I've done a lot of. If this were a channel reviewing series of Race Across the World, then I would be able to talk about many things. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the books that I've been reading this week. Yeah, so let's get started. So first up, a novel that I've been wanting to read for a really long time. It'd been on my shelves for a while, and that is Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl by Andrea Lawlor. And apart from having maybe one of the best titles for a novel that I've seen in a good while, it also has these really great pull quotes on the front, at least on my version, that I just think are really great. So it's just sort of like tight, Eileen Myles, deep, Michelle T, hot, Maggie Nelson, smut, The New Yorker. And I love that. I think what better way to sell a book? Anyway, so the novel is about a character called Paul, and it's a very odd kind of book. It really plays around with a sense of reality, and it's quite dreamlike in ways. But essentially we have a character of Paul, who when we first meet them in the novel, is a gay man and is living a life in the US, just really getting out and about. Sleeping with people, having quite a sort of rich sort of form of nightlife, shall we say. And this book, at one point, he realizes that he essentially has the power to shapeshift to some degree, and he can, to some degree, will his body to do what it wants, what he wants it to do in terms of transforming parts of it. And so if he is able to focus enough, he, at various points in this book, is able to take the form of a mortal girl. He is able to essentially transform into a woman's body. And the novel then has him exploring bits of identity in both. So he is walking around at the beginning of this novel, sleeping with a fair few men, really kind of living this good life. He is able to transform his body at times to be sort of a woman's body, and then he will date people and maybe sleep with people and whatever. And although on the surface this novel sounds like it's just going to be playing around with the sort of sexy fun part of that, the novel then also does really dig into some deeper conversations in a really interesting way, I think, because the novel, this shape-shifting essentially allows him to explore quite a lot of other parts of identity. He's almost always an outsider because he will be able to reappear in situations as somebody different, and sometimes that means that he is he sort of sees the sort of thin edge of things around sexism or around sort of femphobia or various other things happening, and so he just really lives in various parts in this world. And it becomes a much more poignant book, I think, about how a life is best lived, because at one point he is in the form of a mortal girl and he is dating a woman, and there is a sense that people he dates often say, well, I don't know if you're going to change and leave me at any point. But this is quite a toxic relationship that he finds himself in, and he tries to leave the situation, but at some point he realizes that he has been in the form of a woman for a really long time, and typically he switches more frequently, so he's almost worried that he will get stuck in one direction, so that if he doesn't keep shifting and changing, he will forever become sort of fossilized, as it were, in one of those bodies. And so it's then really interesting because he has to navigate, essentially, will he stay one way for a relationship, or will he continue to be himself and morph and change at the risk of potentially jeopardizing relationships, which feels like a much broader point coming in about the ways that we change or reduce ourselves, or kind of limit ourselves in various ways for other people, and particularly in romantic relationships, the ways that we might want to change everything about ourselves to fit a partner only to then realize that we've maybe lost the sense of who we are in that process. And so I think this is a really poignant and beautiful book, whilst also being incredibly silly and sexy and over the top and you know, just this really high intensity book. I just think it does so many things, and it's just a really fascinating piece of writing. I was really blown away by this. Next, a very different book indeed, Ducks by Kate Beaton, and she's best known for her graphic novel Hark! A Vagrant, which is, it deals a lot more with history. It's really funny and silly and offbeat. It has this real left field, ironic, sardonic kind of tone, and it's brilliant. It's very funny. I highly recommend it. And a friend gave me this as a present for my birthday ages ago, and this is a very different book indeed, but one that I think is fantastic in the way that it does it. So Kate Beaton grew up in Cape Breton in Nova Scotia in Canada, and particularly Cape Breton, she writes about in this book as it's one of the areas, particularly we see at the beginning of this book, where there aren't a ton of jobs. It's not massively populated. It's not a very wealthy area. There aren't necessarily any big industries that bring in tons and tons of money in quite the same way that some other provinces in Canada have. And so what she notices, well, this is a kind of common thing in a lot of Canada, where particularly in that period of time when she was in her 20s, lots of people from particularly those parts of Canada that maybe didn't have as many industries, including Newfoundland, would often go to Alberta to be part of the tar sands and the oil and various other boom areas. But essentially it was one of those things where Alberta had tons of oil and needed as many workers as possible to make as much money as possible in that moment, more than Alberta really had. So they brought in a lot of labour from other parts of Canada. And so what you see is a lot of people from poorer areas of Canada who maybe don't have as much work, doing a year out in the tar sands or longer and making far more money than they'd ever make in any other job locally. And they tend to sort of bring that money back. In Kate Beaton's case, she's also wanting to pay off her student loans. And the book starts with that as a bit of a premise. She wants to pay off her student loans because she's gone to university and is not making any money. She sort of wants to be a cartoonist or an illustrator, but she knows there's not a great deal of money in it. And she's at a stage where, you know, the student loan company is going to come calling very soon and she won't have much to be able to pay them. So she thinks, okay, I'm going to do this for a bit and see how this goes. And this is where the book really starts. And it gets quite dark quite quickly because she's essentially in, that was unintentionally coming to a very pretty illustration page, but she essentially moves into an area like this, which is a plant working, she has more of an office-based job. She is part of the sort of counting tools and making sure all of that's all sorted and everything like that. But what she basically starts to see very quickly is not only is she one of the only women, it's a ratio of about 50-1, I think she says at one point. But also it's an incredibly bleak atmosphere. These are people working kind of in the middle of nowhere in a place that doesn't really have any other natural entertainment or anything around it. You know, you're either working or you're in your kind of dorm relaxing on your days off. There are some towns nearby, but you have to drive quite far and you maybe have to borrow a truck. And the whole place feels quite desolate and quite removed from everything. And as the book goes on, we have a few really harrowing moments that I think she does brilliantly in this book, of particularly talking about sexual assault and particularly her own sexual assault. And it's heartbreakingly done because what is already quite a sort of simplistic and kind of jaunty style at times. You've got this kind of, these sort of little faces and everything like that. The pages just after, around and just after her abuse become very quiet. There are no speech bubbles. It becomes very withdrawn. There are just pages of her just going down corridors that are empty and things like that. It's harrowing the way it's done, but really powerfully illustrated at the same time. And as the book goes on, we see her in various stages of the kind of aftermath of that. She at one point leaves, she tries to have a life somewhere else, but realizes she's not making nearly enough money and the student loans company is still calling. So she goes back and does a second year, which thankfully is slightly better. But in that second year, she becomes a little bit more aware to the issues around doing something like this, where, for example, she watches a video by an indigenous elder talking about the ways that the extraction of this affect local indigenous people. And she suddenly becomes very aware to the fact that she'd never questioned the fact that there was a town really near lots of these plants. That's actually a town where there's an indigenous tribe. And so this is a tribe that have now grown up with plants all around them, meaning that, you know, their water quality is ruined, their air quality is ruined, plants don't really grow, all of these other things. And so the book becomes slightly angrier, or I suppose more aware as it goes along, where she suddenly can't really countenance everything that's going on around her. It's not only the rampant sexual harassment and sexism and abuse that are going on around her. It's also the fact that she looks around her, sees lots of men who she basically grew up with, or who are from various similar areas to her, like Cape Breton or Newfoundland, and realizes that these are men who, in some cases, maybe didn't finish school, or maybe struggled in the education system, and this is one of their only real options for making good money and providing for their families. But at the same time, it's having horrible effects on their health, on the environment, on many other things. And so this book suddenly twists into this really interesting critique, or kind of expose almost, I guess, to some degree, of this industry, and the fact that the kind of basically drawing a link between the extraction happening in Alberta, these people's lives, the exploitation of various communities, and all these other things. And it just becomes this really powerful book, and something you wouldn't necessarily expect from what is otherwise quite like a jaunty style of these characters with these, this sort of simplistic illustration style that I think is really effective. And so, yeah, I just think this is a really fabulous book. I've spoken about this for a really long time. I think this is a really wonderful piece of writing, and it really blew me away by how much it's able to do, often with very few words, and with only images. And last but not least, I read Robert McFarlane's Is a River Alive? And I've been looking forward to this for a while. I love the books I've read so far by Robert McFarlane. He's a British nature writer, but he often writes in this way where his nature writing feels like these are novels almost. There's such a wealth of description, and the writing is just such beautiful quality that I have just been completely blown away every time I've read something by him. And this was no exception. Is a River Alive is essentially an attempt to look at nature, and particularly water life, and the ways that humans approach them. And so at the beginning of the book, he goes on several different journeys throughout the book, but often coming into contact with indigenous peoples who will talk about their perception of the land. He digs a bit into the legal part, so he talks about how a few countries instituted policies that essentially gave rivers legal status as beings. In some cases, that sort of meant essentially classing them as human. And what that then throws up is obviously this question: is a river alive? He talks about how, in doing so, in creating policy to do so, this obviously protects rivers, but also acknowledges the fact that rivers can be sources of so much life around them, that it's not just the water itself, it's all of the ecosystems that rely on that. The fact that a river can die, a river can either be dried out or can be so poisoned or become so toxic that it no longer does what it was going to do. And so the book, I think, just really beautifully makes a case for us to more deeply appreciate nature. But also, in doing so, I think, is just so full of wonder at the world and what it can be. It brings in so many different perspectives from all across the world. We have moments of him on these grand adventures out in the world, and it particularly leads towards one at the end, and I won't spoil parts of how that goes, but he essentially is going on a several-day journey towards a specific place with the goal of asking the river one question. And he is told beforehand that he can only ask the river one question. And this is almost where it feels like a novel at the same time. And so he is really wrangling with this idea of what is the thing that's so important to me that it can be the only one question I ask a river, and I've got to make it count. And in doing so, again, it brings up all of these ideas of what is important. It becomes a rallying call about humanity to protect nature, but also an acknowledgement of the ways that nature enriches our lives and all these other things. I just think this is a really brilliant piece of writing, particularly as this is a book that on its surface you would think reading several hundred pages about rivers might not be the most exciting. He's able to imbue all of that with just this love and care, and particularly wonder, that for me just makes this just such a phenomenal piece of writing. I just loved this. It's so clever and brilliant, and I really highly recommend you read it. The audiobook is done by Robert McFarlane himself, which is how I read it. And there's something, again, quite dreamlike about having somebody talk about how excited they are. At times this feels like a thriller novel with something happening out in the wild. At times this feels like a love letter to nature. It's a really brilliant piece of writing, I think. So those are the books I've been reading this week. I hope you're doing really well. I hope you're doing better than my hair is doing. Take care and speak to you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.